Imagine a world where an entire population vanishes, leaving behind only a name that echoes through history. This is the story of Old Prussia, a realm of warriors and pagans obliterated under the iron heel of the Teutonic Knights. The Germans were coming, and with them, the absolute destruction of a people and their way of life. Our chapter begins in the 13th century amid the fervor of the Crusades, a time when the cross and the sword sought to expand Christendom's borders to the very edges of the known world. Here on the Baltic shores, Old Prussia, a land of fierce warriors and ancient traditions, stood in stark contrast to the encroaching Christian realms. The Christian rulers had spent great effort to subjugate the pagan Prussian tribes, but to no avail. At the dawn of the 13th century, after decades of war, the Prussians still stood strong, often raiding their Christian counterparts. Yet, this resilience would soon be tested against a force unlike any the Prussians had faced before. Having failed to subjugate the Prussians, the Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia invited the Iron Fist of Christendom, the Teutonic Knights, a crusading military order of German origin, veterans of crusades in the Holy Lands. The arrival of the Teutonic Knights marked the beginning of an era of unprecedented destruction, where the fabric of Prussian society would be relentlessly torn apart. The Knights started to arrive in numbers around the 1230s, setting the stage for over half a century of constant warfare and destruction. The Prussian Crusade, as it later was named, was not just a military campaign, it was a mission of conversion and subjugation, armed with divine sanction by the Pope and superior military might. The Teutonic Order launched a relentless assault on the Prussian tribes. As the Teutonic Knights set their grand strategy into motion, the landscape of Old Prussia began a transformation marked by fortresses of conquest. Unlike their predecessors, the Knights focused on building a string of fortified outposts and castles to solidify their hold on conquered lands. In 1230, the Crusaders began their fortifications at the Polish stronghold of Chelmno. By 1232, a joint Polish-German force had pushed northeast from Chelmno to establish a new fort at Marienwerder, while another fort at Rieden protected the lands to the east of Chelmno. With this first ring of forts completed, they served as a base from which to raid the lands of the nearby Pomeranians until their eventual surrender. From the surrendered Pomeranians, the Crusaders commandeered their riverboats to sail north and established a new fort at Elbing and another called Christburg. These forts were strategically placed to cut off the Pomeranians from their main trade routes, effectively forcing them to sue for peace. In 1239, the new fort at Balga was garrisoned, new colonists were brought in, and nearby tribes were pacified. Until this point, the losses of the Crusaders, despite the heavy fighting, had been relatively light, but this was about to change. In 1242, recognizing that the new German settlements established by the order were competing with his merchants, Duke Swantopelk of Danzig concluded an alliance with the Prussians. This alliance sparked what would become known as the First Prussian Uprising, during which the Prussians destroyed most of the order's smaller forts and reclaimed their lands. Following these events, despite continuous bitter fighting, the war entered a stalemate. On one side, the Prussians and their allies in Danzig roamed the countryside, while on the other, the order maintained control over some key forts and used the rivers for supply runs. Unable to subdue the Prussians with the sword, the order switched to diplomacy. Under pressure from the Pope, who threatened to preach a new crusade against him, the Duke of Danzig made peace with the Teutonic Order in 1248. Having lost their main ally, the Prussians agreed to a peace treaty the following year. Although this formally concluded the fighting, the peace did not last long. In the autumn of the same year, Prussian forces massacred the Knights at the Battle of Krücken. The fighting reignited, and it wasn't until 1253 that the last of the Western Prussian tribes was subdued. After this, it was time for the main prize, the Samland region, which was the richest and most populous of the Prussian lands. However, their first attempt ended disastrously. The Crusader army that attacked Samland in 1252 was utterly defeated, and their leader was killed in the process. This setback sent the order on a recruiting spree across Europe. Meanwhile, their Livonian branch established a new fort at Memel to isolate the Sambians from their fellow pagans in Samogitia. The establishment of Memel also provides a glimpse into how the war was conducted at times. According to contemporary chronicles, the founding was accomplished by burning an existing native city to the ground and exterminating the entire population that lived there, who were to be replaced by German colonists. In 1254, the Crusaders invaded Samland once again, this time with a massive army. According to sources, some 60,000 men took part. The Prussians were crushed at the Battle of Rudau, exterminated en masse, and new forts were erected. By 1259, what remained of the Sambians and the nearby tribes were forced to surrender. So, after decades of war and several setbacks, things finally seemed promising for the Teutonic Order. However, once again, this was about to change. In 1260, the order suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Samogitians, followed by a general rebellion by the indigenous peoples in Prussia that nearly collapsed the military power of the order. Many of their garrisons and colonies were massacred, and the Crusaders' reinforcements were wiped out at the Battle of Pokrovus in 1261. The Prussians in 1260 were a very different force. Now they were also using crossbows and siege engines, two weapons that previously had given a huge advantage to the Crusaders. They also showed mastery of river warfare, open battles, and sieges. By 1264, the order had suffered several defeats and was on the brink of being driven out of Prussia. But once again, they were saved by the influx of new Crusaders from Germany. The fort's sieges were lifted, the waterways reopened, and the Prussian lands were impoverished by systematic ravaging. The rebelling tribes were forced either to submit or to emigrate. Those who submitted had to accept garrisons and the demotion of their chiefs to feudal vassals under the order. Meanwhile, their forts were rebuilt as brick or stone castles. By 1277, all the central tribes of Prussia had been subjugated. To the east, the remaining Prussian tribes engaged the Crusaders in guerrilla warfare, a tactic at which they were particularly adept. However, they lacked the sheer numbers to contend with their German, Polish, and Volhynian adversaries, and Prussian nobility began gradually surrendering one by one. In the summer of 1283, the Teutonic Order marched into Sudovia with a large army and negotiated the surrender of the remaining Prussians. Those who surrendered were resettled into other parts of German-owned Prussia, and those who did not emigrated east to Lithuanian lands. The once rich province of Sudovia was left unpopulated, becoming a border wilderness between Christian realms and their pagan neighbors to the east. Despite all the carnage they had endured, the Prussians made two more attempts at revolt, in 1286 and 1295, hoping that in both cases, the external enemies of the Teutonic Order, mainly Lithuania, would intervene on their behalf. But it was too late. The revolts were easily crushed, and by the end of the 13th century, the lands of Prussia were firmly under the control of the Knights. In the end, the Prussians could not match the power of the Knights, who could draw from a very large manpower pool from Christian Europe, and the outcome was catastrophic. The once thriving Prussian society was shattered, its people killed or assimilated, their identity lost to the annals of history. German settlers poured in, diluting what remained of the Prussian legacy. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Prussian name endured, but its bearers were no more, absorbed into the burgeoning German state of Prussia. The original Prussians became a footnote in their own land's history.